Hello, we are Group 3 of the Anthropology 278 class, and we are doing our presentation on the court case of Dred Scott versus Sandford. So our topic for our presentation is Dred Scott v. Sandford, which was a Supreme Court case regarding how citizenship for African Americans was not included within the Constitution of the United States.
I will introduce you the details of dress code versus Sandford. The first part is who are dress code and Sandford. Dress code is an African American who was born as a slave around 1799 in Southampton County in Virginia. His first owner was Peter Blow. He lived in two slave states, Alabama and Missouri, before Peter died. After Peter died, Dred was purchased by Dr. John Emerson and was taken to Illinois, a free state. Later, Dred was taken to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory, a free state, by Dr. John Emerson. There, Dred married Harriet Robson, who was also a slave. In 1843, John Emerson died. Afterwards, Dred and Harriet became his wife. Irene Sandford's property. Though Dred and Harriet tried to purchase their freedom, but Irene refused. Irene's refusal to give Dred and Harriet later led Dred filed lawsuits for freedom. April 1846, Dred and Harriet filed lawsuits for freedom in St. Louis Circuit Court against Irene Sandford based on two Missouri statutes. One statute allowed African Americans to sue for wrongful enslavement. The other statute allowed African Americans who were taken to free territories to become automatically free and to not be enslaved again after returning to slave states. In 1850, the jury in the second trial declared Dred Scott free based on the Dred's years of residence in free states in Illinois and Wisconsin. In 1853, Irene appealed the case to Missouri Supreme Court, and the verdict of St. Louis Circuit Court was overthrown by Missouri Supreme Court. Dred and Harriet became slaves again. In 1854, Dred brought a new lawsuit to the U.S. Court for the District of Missouri. The jury decided Dred and his family were not free. In 1856, Dred appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court denied African Americans national citizenship and stated African Americans are constitutionally unable to file suit in the federal courts. Additionally, the U.S. Supreme Court also declared that the provision in Missouri Compromise that permit to Congress to prohibit slavery in territories are unconstitutional.
Popular and pervasive stereotypes. Today, we see stereotypes are used against African Americans as a direct consequence of scientific racism and legal challenges put against them historically. Specifically, this outcome of the case disregarded the humaneness and being of these people. Some of these historic phrases include, but aren't limited to, mammy, mandingo, which also meant the black buck, sapphire, Uncle Tom, and watermelon. These terms were used to commodify and justify the business of slavery and its processes as a way of everyday functioning in society. Characteristics of African Americans included that they were lazy, submissive to their owners, and lacked honesty, which all contributed to how they were looked as inferior as a race. These were created and coined decades ago, but these phrases and terms still hold true to current iterations of and about Black people in our society as stereotypes and throughout the history of our country. The stereotypes explained. Uncle Tom was derived from a character from Harriet Stowe's 1852 novel. It was a derogatory term used to describe a black man as submissive, obedient, and in constant desire of white approval. Sapphire painted a picture of women being aggressive and violators of social norms that they were always supposed to obey. Mammy was an offensive term developed during the times of slavery, and it was used to legitimize it. It painted a picture as the domestic worker. In this case, and in most cases, it was a lot of women being loyal to their slave owners. The exact opposite of sapphire. Watermelon originally symbolized self-sufficiency, but later, in the Jim Crow era, became very racist and symbolized food, as a watermelon being eaten by slaves and was seen as unclean and messy, which became characteristics of these slaves. Mandingo, or the black buck, was a term that coined the characteristics of strength and agility in black males, which made them seem animal-like, and this led to white mobs being able to kill and beat these men as a safety precaution and reason. It legitimized killing black people.
Hello, my name is Becky, and I'll be talking about one of the main topics regarding the Dred Scott v. Sandford case. My topic I decided to utilize is the researcher Nathaniel S. Shaler. He was an American scientist who had very strong beliefs about African American people's place in American society. One of his strongest beliefs was that inferior people lacked any sense of nationality in the country. His assumption was driven by the fact that he believed that African Americans were too preoccupied with their previously formed habits and traditions that in turn created a divide between them and the rest of the primarily Caucasian American society. This division then in turn made it impossible for African Americans to develop any political qualities. What he meant by this was that African Americans didn't have the mental capacity in order to think about these types of complex topics such as politics. This could have been formed by his own bias about African Americans and what he thought of them, but it also could have been driven by the fact that he didn't think they could handle the responsibilities that came with being a citizen. This was due to the fact that African Americans were born into an American caste system where minorities were part of the inferior, and those in the inferior level did not have any opportunity to form any form of individuality, which then would give them the chances to form opinions and be able to understand complex ideas. But because they didn't have that, they couldn't handle those responsibilities. And when you're born into the inferior, you're seen more as a big group rather than an individual person. So you can't really form your own individual opinions. Now connecting this court case to scientific racism, I decided to talk about how the United States decided that a black person could not be a citizen of the United States due to the U.S. Constitution. And that was pretty much formed by the idea that black people are inferior to white people, and according to many, were part of an actual different species. This can be seen through the research done by Josiah Nott, Samuel Morton, Louis Agassiz, and multiple different other scientists, all of which used their research and a lot of times data that they formulated on their own to prove the fact that black people are an inherently different species than white people, meaning they don't have the same intellectual capabilities or ability to hold responsibilities, such as we are talking about within Nathaniel Shaler and his understanding of African Americans and politics.
Was the case valid? It first originated in front of Missouri state courts, but became more political 11 years later when it was appealed by the Supreme Court, eventually becoming a federal issue. Ideas presented that this case was determined through prearranged statements of facts and an assertion that Dred Scott was in fact owned by John Sandford. In reality, Sandford is not the owner of Scott, and knowing this truth might have changed the case results or its eligibility to come before the Supreme Court, since there was no actual evidence of who Scott belonged to. It brought forward some interesting questions regarding the ownership of Scott and Sandford's openness to being sued when he decided to move forward with his claim in court. This is relevant because it directly ties to the legitimacy of historical upbringing in the court with the lack of knowing actual truth or evidence.
So much of this case, including its retrials and decisions, were dependent upon technicalities, all of which were tied to slavery policies and the racism institutionalized in the system. In the beginning history of what led to this case being seen before the Supreme Court of the United States, Scott went to court for his emancipation. His grounds were that he had a claim to freedom because he had stayed in Illinois and Wisconsin, both free states, for an extended period of time. He was denied this due to the technicality of not being able to submit the paperwork that confirmed he and his wife Harriet were owned by Emerson's widow. In an 1850 retrial, the St. Louis court held that Scott and his wife were free. But then, just 2 years later, the decision was reversed by the Missouri Supreme Court, making Scott an enslaved man again. The ownership of Scott, theoretically, had passed from Emerson's widow to her brother, John F. A. Sandford. Shortly after this, Sandford moved to New York, a free state. Here, Scott took advantage of living in a free state and the diversity jurisdiction it had. But, under yet another technicality, Scott was denied this because it was argued that diversity jurisdiction only applied to citizens of the state, and being a descendant of a slave, Scott was not a citizen of anywhere. Taney of the Supreme Court of the United States at the time, who was a large contributor in the final ruling of Scott's case, also argued that under the Fifth Amendment, slaves were a possession of property, and to deprive their owner from the right to their own property was unconstitutional. Taney also held that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, so he did not allow Congress to free slaves within federal territories. This decision showed respect for the Missouri courts because they held that moving to a free state did not render Scott emancipated.
Racism is still prevalent. The first example is Birther movement, which alleged Obama ineligible to serve as president by doubting whether he was born in Hawaii. For them, they believed that Obama was born in Kenya. Therefore, he is ineligible for presidency. Trump was the leading opponent of Obama's presidency. Actually, Trump not only targets at African Americans, but also Muslims. For example, he called to ban Muslims from entering America in 2015. He also claims that Muslims hate Americans. Today, black people also experience unfair treatment in the legal system. In recent years, many unarmed black people were murdered by white cops. Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Philando Castillo. These facts all show that racism does not cease in modern society.